when I began studying psychology, I got into it because I was really interested in understanding human behaviour. Like, I wanted to know why people did the things that they do. But I remember being completely disinterested in mental illness. I don't mean that as like a bad thing. I just wasn't interested in mental illness at the time. I don't even really remember learning much about it in my undergraduate years, like maybe at a superficial level, like that depression was or could result from a chemical imbalance in the brain, or that the fight-flight system is activated in times of stress. I do remember feeling really terrified at the thought that somebody with severe depression or a personality disorder could become a client of mine. That actually scared the shit out of me. So when I had to choose an area to focus on in my honours year of study, I applied to a professor of positive psychology to be my supervisor. You see, positive psychology was perfect for me. It meant that I could avoid all the things about psychology that made me uncomfortable, and instead I could focus on the good things in life, on flourishing, on thriving, on strengths, on values and virtues. And see, I wasn't alone. Since Martin Seligman became the president of the American Psychological Association and used that platform to promote this new field of positive psychology, it has, for lack of a better word, flourished. The aim was to shift the thinking from asking clients or patients what's wrong to asking them what's right. And if the measure of success of an initiative is media attention and reach, then positive psychology is an absolute sensation. It sold billions of books. There are podcasts where people spill the secrets to happiness, apps that you can use to make yourself happier and happier and happier, inspirational quotes by the squillion. It's even graced the cover of Time magazine. Schools these days have wellbeing officers. Corporate organisations across the US and UK are actually hiring chief happiness officers to make sure that you will always have a smile on your face at work. Some of you might have read The Secret. Do you want to know the real secret though? This shit doesn't work. I hate to sound negative. No, I love to sound negative. I hate to sound negative, but positive psychology is an idea that needs to die. So look, to qualify, all right, I'm an academic. I don't make big outlandish statements like that. Some elements of it can work with the right professional and the right client in the right time, in the right way. But you see, positive psychologists have a bit of a reputation for uncritically accepting findings that are in favour of positive psychology and rejecting or ignoring any findings to the contrary. This idea, this tendency to look at only the positives has actually infiltrated the science of it. And so in the spirit of scientific fairness, I'm going to let you in on the real secrets. We're going to go through a couple of the pillars of positive psychology. We're going to go through 3 strategies that positive psychologists will typically endorse or promote, and we're going to shoot them in the head one by one. So the first one we're going to talk about is gratitude. And if you're not familiar with the concept of gratitude, it's basically the idea that you should be thankful for the good things that we have in life. So a typical gratitude intervention would involve sitting down at the end of the day and writing a list of 3 things that you're grateful for that happened. And the study that was really the impetus behind this was a 2003 study by a couple of guys called Emmons and McCullough. And I'll give you the short version of what they did. They took 192 undergraduate psychology students who were participating in their study in return for course credit. These days it's sort of known as student slavery, but we're not going to talk about the ethics of it. What they did was they took those students and they split them up into 3 different groups. The first group had to, at the end of it, it was a 9-week testing period, so the first group were assigned to the gratitude condition, and what they had to do was at the end of each week they had to list 5 things that they were grateful for that happened that week. The hassles condition had to think about 5 hassles that they experienced and list those. And then there was a neutral group, and they just had to think of 5 things that impacted on them in some way during the week and write them down. And they measured their mood and well-being. And don't freak out, for those not statistically inclined, it's just a couple of numbers, it's really basic, I'll talk you through it. You've got the gratitude condition, the hassles condition, and the neutral condition. And what these numbers show, just for context, they're out of 7. But what the statistics appear to show, this is the average well-being at the end of the 9-week period for each group. And what they appear to show is that the gratitude group, or people assigned to the gratitude condition, had an average higher well-being score than those in both the hassles and the neutral conditions. There's a little bit of a problem with this, which is that the authors decided, they specifically wrote in their paper that they omitted the first report on well-being because the participants completed it before they actually took part in the intervention. Look, I'm an experimental scientist. I don't know how many of you guys are, but if you've ever done any experimental research at all, you should probably recognise that there's one thing that's really, really crucial when you're trying to look for a change in something, and that's having a baseline. And these guys decided that they just weren't going to report that wasn't needed for them. They actually omitted the most critical piece of information. And so what that means is that we actually have no idea whether any of this had anything to do with the intervention, or whether the people that just happened to be assigned to the gratitude condition in the first place had higher life satisfaction to begin with. Then with regard to their mood scores, what the authors reported was that people in the gratitude condition reported at the end of this 9-week period that they felt more grateful, more thankful, and more appreciative than people in the other two groups. I mean, of course they did. They just did a gratitude intervention and the other guys didn't. But what the authors didn't report was that they had a bunch of other mood measures here, and the participants in the gratitude condition didn't report any higher scores in terms of how happy they were, in terms of how content they felt, in terms of how alert, enthusiastic, excited. They didn't report any lower scores than the other groups on how stressed they felt, on how anxious, on how frustrated, on how angry or tired they felt. What happened was the gratitude intervention improved gratitude. And you might say that that's a really good thing, but that's if gratitude's a good thing. See, there's a dangerous downside to gratitude. When you're grateful to somebody, you technically owe them. And in the author's own words, gratitude has an obligatory aspect. People are expected to repay kindnesses, and most people experience indebtedness as an unpleasant and aversive psychological state. You're welcome. Let's move on to forgiveness. A positive psychologist might tell you that if you want to be happy, you should forgive people. You should let go of all the anger and resentment. So one of the strategies they might tell you to do is to write a letter to somebody who has transgressed you and forgive them for their wrongdoing. Not a good idea. For those of you who heard me speak at Real Big Things last year, you would know that I like to talk about my grandfather. He was a Holocaust survivor, and I asked him a couple of years ago whether he forgave the Nazis for what they did to him. And he told me that he didn't, and he told me that specifically there were 3 things that he couldn't forgive them for. He couldn't forgive them for taking him away from his mother as a 9-year-old boy. He couldn't forgive them for robbing him of a childhood, and he couldn't forgive them for denying him the chance at a proper education. He explained to me that when you forgive somebody, you're saying that you understand what they did. You're saying that it was okay, and it's not. And see, not surprisingly, the research actually supports my grandfather's view. In 2010, a study published a paper where they described what's known as the Doormat Effect, which is what happens when you become the person who will forgive everybody for everything that they do to you. And when people know that about you, you become a target. You become somebody that people can take advantage of. You literally turn yourself into the doormat that people can walk all over. Think about that next time you say you're sorry. And the last strategy I'm going to talk about is probably the most annoying of all, at least for me. It's the idea that we should recite positive affirmations, that we should stand in front of the mirror and say, I am beautiful, I am loved, I'm a good person. The idea is that, if we say those things enough times, then we'll start to believe them. And this is great for people who already have a pretty positive view of themselves, because these are thoughts that we will automatically endorse and we'll automatically believe. They're consistent with what we think about ourselves. But for people who don't really feel great about themselves, it doesn't have the same effect. For those people, what actually happens is their brain recognises that there's a discrepancy between what they actually feel and what they're forcing themselves to say. And for people with low self-esteem, the research shows that performing this activity actually makes them feel worse. See, unfortunately, the rapid growth and uptake of positive psychology preceded the rigorous scientific evidence that is needed to push something like this in this way. And if you think it's not a big deal, I'm going to give you 2 examples of how this has been rolled out in the big stage. In 2009, the US government awarded $31 million to Martin Seligman and his team in response, or they needed to address what is quite a disturbing thing that's happening, and it happens here too with military personnel and their families. Right? There are shocking rates of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, suicide, distress. And so what they did was they gave Seligman $31 million, a non-competitive grant, which is also not the way that we usually do science. And what they had to do was design and roll out a new intervention for veterans and their families. Now, I mean, the first thing that's a little bit weird about this is that you don't normally roll out a pilot study en masse to a specifically vulnerable and group who are exposed to trauma. You just don't do that, first off. But after 3 separate evaluations that have now been conducted on this, it's become pretty clear that it doesn't work. This whole program to build resilience in veterans that's been based entirely on positive psychology principles has resulted in no reduction in PTSD, no reduction in rates of suicide, no reduction in rates of depression. It simply doesn't work. And this happens here too. It happens in our schools. So if you've got kids at school, you're probably aware that there's some sort of positive education program that's happening in their classrooms, and schools here are spending millions of dollars on these programs each year. This is despite cautions expressed by a professor in the US named Roy Baumeister, who was doing this stuff way before positive psychology even was a thing. He was in the 80s and 90s encouraging interventions to boost self-esteem in young children. And he released a report in 2005 after his own evaluations of it and said, look, I've been doing this, but we need to cut this. I was wrong. He said in his words, I have created a generation of narcissists. And yet, it's almost like this stuff has gone too far and we can't back out of it from now. These programs are preying on naive and vulnerable parents and children, and it's not cool. See, I see these kids when they grow up. They become my clients. They become the kids, the adolescents, the young adults who sit in my office, in my consulting suite, and tell me they're sad and tell me they're lonely. And I believe that positive psychology has a lot to answer for this loneliness epidemic that we're now seeing, because these kids haven't had the opportunity to experience negative emotions, and nobody has had the opportunity or has given them the opportunity to talk about it. What has happened is that when they've experienced negativity, they've been told to just think positive, and it doesn't work. I'm not talking about sort of the loser weird kids who you always expect to end up in a psychologist's office. I'm talking about the good-looking kids, the school captains, the best players in the footy team, the kids who come to me and tell me that they have 3 friends in the world. One of the things I say is that if we want to teach children how to be happy, we need to teach them how to be sad. We need to teach them how to be upset. We need to teach them how to be angry. We need to teach them how to be frustrated. We need to be able to sit with them, and we need to become comfortable with the uncomfortable. We need to provide them with an opportunity and with the language to communicate these things and say that we're willing to talk about it with them. We understand. Since positive psychology emerged, mental health problems, or the prevalence of mental health problems, has increased. I'm not saying it's causal, but I don't think that it's wise that we continue to push an agenda that has been proving to be ineffective time and time again. Now, sometimes I do this talk and people tell me that I'm negative. So there's a difference between critique and criticism, but that's another talk. They tell me that, I should just try some positive psychology exercises and maybe I'll feel better. Let's give it a go. What better stage than right here? I'm grateful that I had the opportunity to talk to you all today. I forgive you if you hate me for crushing your idealistic views of the world. And I need to finish on a positive affirmation. I did a pretty good job, didn't I? I'm fucking awesome! Thanks, guys.